Hi, my name is Dale Mazzarella. I'm a Fly Fishers International Master Casting Instructor, a longtime Wyoming fishing guide, and an award-winning coach and educator. I've put together this video series that I hope will help you become a better fisherman, catch a lot more fish, and I hope you enjoy it. So enjoy yourself, have a good time, and let me know what you think. We're going to talk about equipment today. You know, fly fishing equipment isn't really complicated and it doesn't take a whole lot of work, but there are some things that you can do to prevent having problems and losing some fishing days. So let's start with the rod first. So I've got a rod in a case. The first thing that I do is make sure that when I go, we're going to start at the very beginning of a fishing day and then finish when we get home. So we'll take that progression to kind of make it more usable. First thing, remember to bring your rod. I can't tell you how many times I've had clients show up at the river and they've forgotten their rod, which is okay because I have some, but I mean, it's kind of embarrassing if you forget your rod. So make sure you bring your rod, first off. Secondly, I don't ever put my rod together until I'm ready to actually head to the water. What I see is people putting their rod together when they first get out of their car, they stick it someplace, and then who knows, the wind blows it down, somebody runs over it, you know, they put it on the ground. Hey, the rule for me is I put my rod together the very last thing before I head out to the water. When I put it together, it's in my hand and I'm walking to the river. That way you don't have to worry about a rod laying around on the ground. The second thing, when you take your rod out, or the next thing when you take your rod out, you take your rod out of the rod case, and we're going to show you a little bit of a normally, when I take my rod out, I have the butt section, and I usually put the butt section down into the rod, and we'll talk about that when we get done. But the bottom line is you've got your butt section, and you've got your tip section that is the tip. In other words, when you put this back in at the end of the day, you're going to put your tip at the same end as your butt, so your butt section is going to protect your tip. When you put a rod together, when we all put a rod together, let's make sure that, put these things out. And when you're putting a rod together, make sure you're putting your extra pieces. If you're going to take them out of the rod case or the sock before you put them together, make sure they don't just set them on the ground, the back of a tailgate, in the back seat. This little piece here is hard to see. You stick that someplace and you can't see it, somebody's going to step on it. So that's the most common way that I've seen somebody break a rod other than chip it and hit it, which we'll talk about in a minute. So one of the things you can do is you can put the tip section together first. If you put the tip section on right off the bat, now what you've got is you've already got a bigger piece that you can keep track of. The other thing, when you put a rod together, you're going to know this is the ferrule. Let's use the bigger piece, you can see it a little better. But this is the ferrule right here. So we've got a ferrule, and we've got the male end and the female end, and we put it in here. When you put that in, if you can notice that if I seat it all the way, it's right even with my finger. If I seat it way out here, you can see there's a lot of leverage on that and a lot of looseness. During the course of fishing, you're going to want to check that to make sure it's tight on a regular basis. So put it in there. A lot of people tell people to twist it a little bit. And I don't know if that's really what we ought to do, because I've heard some and read some people who make rods who say that's not something you want to do because you can ruin the graphites. But at least set it tight down in there. But first line it up with your stripping guide, or put a reel on if you don't have a stripping guide. A lot of saltwater rods don't have stripping guides, so put a reel on it. So what you're going to do is stick it and really make sure it's firm. You can put ferrule wax on it to help it seat a little better, and that's always a good thing. The old timers used to take a little oil off their nose crease right here and stick it on the rod. In any case, that's the first thing you're going to do, is stick it together. So you're going to put all your rod pieces together, and then when you get done with that, you're going to string your rod. When you string your rod, I usually string my rod. You've got your reel. I put my hat down and I put my reel on my hat. So I put my reel in my hat, and then I'll start working and make sure this piece of the rod can sit on something, the hood of the car, something, a fence post, something like that. Try not to get to about right here and then try to string the rest of the rod and twist and bend the tip. If you bend the tip right here, you can break the tip while you're stringing your rod. So try to string the rod with the rod straight. So now we're going to start fishing. We're going to take off. We're going to walk down to the river, down to the lake, down to the beach, whatever we're going to do. A couple of different theories about that. I usually hold my rod behind me. So I hold my rod like this behind me, normally pretty low, about this level. That way I don't have to worry about hitting stuff. If you're walking with it in front of you like this, you know, the tip is a long ways away. You just hit even a branch this big. If your tip hits just perfectly on that branch, you can break your tip. So I like to hold mine behind me. There are times when I stick it in front of me, but then it's very carefully. So I see some broken rods every year from somebody hiking with their rod in an improper position. So make sure you do that. When you're fishing, when you're actually fishing, a couple of things. If you're fishing nymphs, even a big dry fly with a heavy hook on it, if you whack your fly onto your rod, if your fly ticks that rod, it may not break today, it may not break tomorrow, but that's a good chance you've damaged a little bit of that graphite and it's going to break. So open up your casting arc or do a Belgian or a constant tension cast to try to keep that fly away from your rod. Be really careful of that because that can break it. I'll tell you a couple other things I've seen people break rods on a river. One is they set them on the ground at lunch and now their buddy comes up, doesn't see their rod, steps on it. It's one reason, by the way, I think I use a lot of orange lines just because I like to see the mends, but I also can find my rod and see it if it's laying in the bushes or on the ground, which it should never be doing. And the other thing, I've seen 3 rods in my career get broken by somebody setting it down in the bushes behind somebody who's casting. And it looks like it's out of the way. The person's cast comes by, the fly ticks their rod and breaks their rod, especially if it's a heavier fly or a piece of lead, a piece of BB from a nymph rig. So don't put your rod behind somebody who's fishing and don't lay your rod on the ground while you're having lunch or some other time. Those are definite ways to break your rod. No, when you go to put your rod, once you get done fishing, 2 things when you're fishing. One, let's say you stick on a tree on the other side. You stick on a tree on the other side, don't just pop it like this. That's the way to break a rod. I had a client break one of my rods last summer doing that. He hooked a bush on the other side. He was streamer fishing, not a very long cast, 35, 40 feet or so. He was doing really good. He was casting right up next to the bank and he finally hooks a tree and the first thing he does is do this, and about the second one of these, just as I'm about ready to go, oh, stop, bam, snap, I hear this rod snap and he goes, oh, what happened? Well, what happened was he snapped the rod tip. I've seen people do it on a snag on a bottom doing this. You know, if you're going to do that, you know, unless you've got a lot of experience, just 1 extra pound of pressure and that rod's going to snap. The other thing you don't want to do when you've got a rod is play the fish at too strong an angle, or there's another thing people do. They got a big fish and they're getting tired. They put their hand right here to help them get more leverage. This rod, unless it's a 2-handed rod, this rod is not made for you to put your hand right here and have a lot of pressure on it. That's going to break this rod. I've seen a number of rods, especially snook fishing at night, tarpon fishing, some other situations where somebody who's not very experienced grabs their rod right here, because it's going to help them with leverage. The problem is this rod is not meant to have a fulcrum point way up here. It's meant to be right here. If you put it here, boy, I tell you, you're asking for trouble. So don't put your hand right here. That's a double whammy no-no. So those are things you can do when you're actually fishing. Now we get back to the car. When we get back to the car, sometimes your rod is stuck. You go to get it, man, it just won't come off. That came off. But let's assume, especially in a hot sun, a lot of times darker rods will expand and the ferrule doesn't come apart. There's a couple things you can do. You can carry, you know, it's a rubber kind of stuff they use to open jars, a jar opener rubber. You can carry that and then you can pull it with that. That's pretty effective. What you don't want to do is crank on, especially don't grab the guide and use the guide as leverage to twist it and turn it, because that'll both hurt the guide and can damage the graphite right here. So you want to pull it straight. I just pull it, I kind of put it under my arm and pull it. The other thing you can do is people put it behind them. So they've got it behind them here. See if I can do this without hitting that wall. They put it behind them and pull it this way. Make sure if you do that, you don't have anything to the right or the left, where when it finally comes loose, it's going to smack that tip and then you're in big trouble. So the other thing, you can have two people do it. The most effective way though, you're sitting, you get back to your car and you've got some ice in an ice chest. If you put ice, you can stick this thing in an ice, just take a cube of ice or a block of ice or some ice, or even put it in cold water, walk over to the stream and set it in the cold water. As soon as this cools off, it's going to be way easier to take apart. So that's my preferred way, other than the can opener, the jar opener rubber. I'll use that too. You know, and also you got non-stick, there's sticky rubber that they use in motorhomes and so on to keep stuff from sliding around when the motorhome's moving. That's a really good surface. You can just keep a couple of those pieces and that'll give you a lot more leverage to take this apart. So now we've taken the rod apart, we've unstrung it, we've taken it apart, everything. By the way, the first thing I do when I get back from fishing, before I take my waders off, before I take my vest off, before I do anything else, I make sure that I put my rod away in its rod case. So I'm going to take this thing, I'm not going to worry too much about if I can rinse it. If it's a saltwater rod, then I'm going to try to rinse it at that point in time and I'll put it back in its sock. And when I put it back in its sock, when I get home, I'll take it out and make sure the sock dries and the tube dries and the rod dries. You don't want to put a wet rod and a rod in a sock inside of a tube that's airtight and let it sit there and mildew. You open that up 6 months from now, it's going to be one stinky mess and you're going to have mildew on your cork and every place else. So be kind of careful about that. So now we're ready to put this rod into its sock and then put it inside the case. So first thing I do is I usually put the cork in first, and I take it, you've got 4 compartments in most socks, put it in the biggest sock obviously. Then I take this one, which is, and I put it so that the cork goes in last, and here the big guides go in first. That way the circumference of everything down at the bottom allows you to put everything in. So put this in next. And then I put this one in the same way, upside down, fat part first. And then I put the little one in the same way. And you can do that in a different order. If you want to put the little one in first, you can. So here you are. Now, go ahead and make sure you do whatever you got to do here. Tie this off, put a bow in it. Now, I take the cork end first and put it in here. That way, a lot of times when you put it in this way, you kind of hook stuff. So I put the cork in first and just gently, make sure you don't jam it in. If you jam it in, you're going to get some of those big eyes, and if you break those, if you smash those those guides, now we got it in here. We're ready to take it out. It's pretty simple. You just take it out and you're ready to go. So put the cork in, the big fat end in first. I find that a lot easier, and be careful. Don't jam it in there. Kind of just make sure it rolls in there nice and none of those stripping guides get smashed. Then put the lid on it and you're ready to go. When you finally get home and you've taken this, and make sure you take your rod apart first so you're not setting it down. I've seen people leave rods, I've seen broken rods. Hey, the first thing you do is put it back in its rod case, which brings me to another point. Don't transport a rod in the back of your truck, in the back seat, laying on a bunch of stuff. Anything that chips, anything that hits this rod is going to take it. If it just makes just a tiny little crack in this rod, almost imperceptible, that's big enough that during the course of stress it might break. So be careful about that. When you get home, you can take it out of the sock, you can dry it really good, you can make sure it's dry, you can wash it once in a while, about every, I don't know, depends on how dirty the water is and how mossy it is and how much algae you've got. But I wash this thing in warm water and soap, just get it good and warm. I'll put ferrule wax on the ferrules. Sometimes I'll even clean off the guides because they'll get crusty on the inside, and that's going to result in you're not being able to shoot line quite as effectively. So the inside of your guides can get, the inside circumference of that guide can get a little dirty. So you can clean that off. Just take a rag, a small rag, and pull it through and just twist it and pull it back through, back and forth, like you're flossing your guides. So all that stuff can really help. Store your rod dry. Don't put it in that sock. I can't emphasize that enough. So that's kind of the algorithm that I use when I'm talking about rod care. If you take care of a rod, I've got rods that I bought when I first started fly fishing back in the early 80s. So they're 30, 35 years old, and they look brand new. I've also had some rods that lasted about 6 weeks, and because I screwed up somehow, I broke them. So, or I damaged them. I had guides messed up or whatever else. So take care of your rod and think about what you're doing with the rod. It's going to last you a lifetime.